about how that money is distributed, but we continue to see, even in districts with somewhat declining enrollment, we see significant increases in costs. For instance, the cost of special education continues to rise. The state has capped the special education excess cost grant, so that is no longer the safety net that was there for those extraordinarily costly individual placements. And the federal government has never met their commitment to fund nationwide 40% of the cost of special education. So those, we certainly see a reluctance in most communities by local taxpayers to have any significant increase, if any, in taxes. So those pressures to continue to deliver quality programs, to meet the individual needs of students, to make sure that they're college and career ready, that takes resources. And we're at the point where school districts have cut repeatedly over the years to maintain core programs. There aren't places left to cut. That's really the issue.
And part of the issue, even for the mid-year cuts with the alliance districts, is that the money really comes from the school district rather than the town or city when there are these cuts, because the alliance money goes directly to the school districts. So we're hearing about, at least at this point, where the towns and cities are not able or are unwilling to make up for the cuts. We're hearing about the possibility of fewer teachers, fewer teacher aides, fewer programs. I know in one district they were talking about they had just about started their all-day kindergarten. Now they're going to have to look at it again. I mean, these cuts are large for districts, especially in the middle of the year. And that's all in the context of we don't know where the federal government is going to go. Obviously, we're going to have a new Secretary of Education. The President has talked about $20 billion for vouchers and choice programs. While we're struggling here to keep our districts whole, basically from the stagnation of our economy as costs go up, as Patrice said.
Mm-hmm. And on the topic of vouchers and charter schools, and we do support magnet schools, and we don't assume that every charter school is going to be inappropriate, but the charter schools are really not held to the same level of accountability that public schools are, other public schools are. And the resources can be drained from public schools, more community-based public schools. One of the big concerns about charter schools has to do with the fact that they don't actually accept all children. I mean, they don't have that same kind of expectation that it's their responsibility to serve all the children in a community, whereas public schools absolutely do. I mean, that's what we do, and we do believe in doing it as well as we can do. The special students who have special needs are most definitely eligible to receive supports. And so, when there are charter schools that are promoting themselves in terms of options and, the perhaps even being marketed as being better options, though there's no evidence that that's true, it's a real concern, because we have limited resources in community-based schools anyway, and we want to keep them at the service of the whole student population. So.
Would you be able to describe any legislative initiatives that you are supporting or backing, or you think you will be able to gain support for?
Patrice is our chief lobbyist, and there's one that she's been working on.
In light of the fact that the resources are such a concern, this is a real opportunity, this legislative session, for the General Assembly to provide some relief to the escalating number of requirements that are imposed on school districts. Last session, the legislature created a task force specifically to examine professional development mandates. Those have been added to over the years so that we're now at the point where most of every district's time that's allocated for professional development is consumed in meeting those state mandates. And many of them are not really professional development, as we would know it, but training requirements. And they have to be repeated annually, even though we're talking about adult learners and would have an expectation that they would retain the information from year to year. That is compromising the ability of districts to provide the professional development that they have found to be much more meaningful and that educators have found to be more meaningful, which is much more individualized, personalized, and targeted to an individual educator's needs in order to support student achievement. So the task force met diligently, and it included, I represented CAVE on the task force, it included representatives from the superintendents, principals, as well as the two teachers' unions, and we reached unanimous agreement. That in and of itself is rather remarkable around any issue, and we provided to the legislature a series of very specific recommendations to consolidate the existing mandates and provide more flexibility at the local level to offer professional development. We've been talking to legislators. We were at a meeting yesterday with one of the chairs of the Education Committee, and that is one of the concepts that the Education Committee has raised for public hearing. So that's one that we're very optimistic about.
And I'm going to highlight something, even though you're always so articulate, but there are mandates that we need to hold on to, and that's part of your agreement with your colleagues, that we're not suggesting that all mandates should be just thrown in the trash, because there are some mandates that are very important. I mean, when we're talking about identifying characteristics that children might have been abused or neglected or maltreated, very important that any personnel working with them is able to identify those concerns. And that's just one example. There are lots of other examples as well of mandates that are important, and from time to time there are changes in those mandates, and there needs to be an update, in terms of skill level or training or whatever. So we're not in any way suggesting that all of those should go by the wayside, but they should be freed up so that we're not just being sort of mechanically going through the motions and the rote kind of process of just spending a lot of time, because time is a valuable resource, as we all know. It's not something we should take for granted. So when we're spending time on inappropriate, unnecessary professional development, that is a drain on the resources.
Can you give an example of what some of those things are that should be consolidated or not really mandated, that might be inappropriate to do over and over again?
Sure. There are mandates, very detailed mandates for professional development on prevention of bullying, school climate, social and emotional well-being, all important topics, but not necessary as individualized pieces of training on an annual basis. So that's one example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are some too that, related to Ellis Island. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there as one possible example. Or, I mean, we know that learning about the Holocaust is very, very important, but do people need some update on their professional development every year on the same topic? So we're not in any way suggesting that it's unimportant, but to put it in perspective.
How does it work with the stuff that has to happen every year? Is it just for new teachers? Like, because people come and go, so if they don't have to do the training,
Right.
and they have 5 new people, do they not get the bullying training?
That's a really good question, and I think that that's an important detail, because if somebody has had the updates last year, could they be exempt from it?
Right.
So that's the kind of consideration that I'm sure your task force talked about as well.
Right. And some of this professional development can actually, some of these training requirements can be met as part of a teacher preparation program. And that those skills in terms of how to create a safe school climate should be part of what every teacher receives before they ever enter a classroom.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are others as well that are part of preparation, but also, that they're part of ongoing professionalism, just keeping up with those changes. I think issues like restraint, that there are questions about that, because if a student has the need at times just to have some limits set, the issue of the possibility that everybody would be spending a lot of time learning how to appropriately restrain a student is questionable, in the sense that most of the time you wouldn't want just anybody to be doing that, even if they had been through the training, because it's there are complex behaviors and just a complex set of skills. So going through the motions of just memorizing or something like that is, it should be questioned. It's worth talking about that kind of detail. Another thing to consider is that the technology has changed a lot. So there are opportunities like webinars that people can self-monitor, and they can be documented so that they're actually using existing resources rather than having to spend real time in a room with 20 other people having a session every year. Because do you remember how many hours we're talking?
The estimates are that it's using between 65 and 90 hours a year in order to fully comply with the existing mandates.
And that would be overall.
Right.
So a couple of weeks, basically.
Yeah, and actually most districts don't have a couple of weeks allocated for professional development.
Who is required to pay for all that professional development?
The district has to offer the professional development. So what we're saying is there's currently a requirement that districts offer 18 hours of professional development a year without cost to the teacher. We're not saying back away from the professional development. What we're saying is allow districts to provide the most appropriate professional development for their educators. And teachers have complained about this for years. The idea of the entire faculty, K through 12, sitting in an auditorium, learning about teaching reading skills. Well, my mother taught 12th grade foreign language. At that point, she was not interacting with any students that didn't have reading skills, but she had to go through that professional development on a regular basis.
So would you suggest then that the districts almost have a menu of professional development? And one of the reasons that just occurred to me is because my husband's a lawyer, and now lawyers have to go to
Yes, we do.
a number of hours. I don't remember.
We're one of
what
the
it was.
last states to implement that requirement.
So he's got pamphlets and various things about it, and but I'm pretty sure he gets to pick.
Yeah, maybe one from this group, one from this
Right.
group.
Actually, Connecticut's CLE requirements are very broad, and you can meet them in a variety of ways. As part of the new educator evaluation and support system, one of the things that's incorporated into every educator's evaluation is what type of professional development do they need in order to reach a higher level of performance.
Right, to have it be more individualized,
Exactly.
or tailored to their needs. Yeah, and the other thing is that the RESCs often provide, on a regional basis, they provide opportunities.
Regional Education Service Centers.
Oh, okay.
ACEs.
Like ACEs,
Yeah.
Learn, CREC in the capital region, EastCon in the region I'm living in. So there can, and that's one example, but there often might be collaboration among and between neighboring school districts, because the Common Calendar has opened up some possibilities. The Common Calendar hasn't been enforced 100%. It's not expected that every single district is going to have exactly the same calendar and schedule, but we're seeing more collaboration among and between neighboring districts, and professional development would be one example. Like if a district brought in a special speaker, or and chose to use the professional development opportunities in a meaningful way, sharing that with neighboring towns can be very useful.
And that's some of the discussion on regionalism, versus regionalization. Many school districts, and Williams is one of them, are very small,
We have 100 students, give or take, two.
but it's the center of their communities, and people don't want to give up their schools. But there is always talk from the Moore Commission and others about, excuse me.
Do you want to live?
No, I'm fine, but thank you. About this whole issue, everybody thinks there's going to be a lot of money saved, and the truth is, it's not. We know in Ann's district, for instance, the superintendent works only, how many days a week?
Well, 2 and then some, so it's at least.
But it's not
2.
full-time, so even if you regionalized, you know, you're better off letting districts do what they think is best for their communities.
With some guidance, because very often, very small districts in particular are isolated, and they may have, or we may have some good ideas about what we think would be worthwhile, but we might learn something from talking to folks in Union, which is even smaller than our school, and just to collaborate with other districts, because people have different priorities, but some overlapping priorities, and if we can share resources, that's very beneficial. It's really worthwhile. So we're actually engaged in a lot of community initiative in that area, and we're not alone by a long shot. I mean, I know there are a lot of communities in the northwest corner, particularly very small districts, and you know, they're very parallel kinds of issues, even though some of the demographics may be different, the economy may be different.
We know the demographics are changing in terms of the number of students as well as the population of students, which sort of gets us into diversity and the achievement gap. We've been working on diversity. We certainly serve on all the task force on, the task force on diversity and minority teacher recruitment. We spend a lot of time with that. But we've been talking, thanks Ian, we've been talking also about diversity on school boards, because we want the school boards to represent the community. That's how they work best. And in a lot of districts, the people who make the decisions on who is going to run for the board often don't look at that situation. We had a meeting at our office the other day with board chairs, and I asked, you know, are you working on this? And some of the districts have started working on this. Research shows that if you have board members who are of color, they will be more sensitive to programs and needs of students of color. And we know that we're getting more and more students of color in our districts.
Doesn't that largely also depend on what town committees are going to do?
Well, that's what I was saying, the people who make the decisions on who gets to run. So we're trying to figure out and navigate a way to have, to be able to say to town committees, even though we're not political, that you have to start thinking about these issues too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what some of our chairs are doing. One of them told us in this meeting I was at, he's been sitting down with the town committee chairs and saying, you know, we can't be all white. We you know, 45% of the community are people of color, whether it's black, whether it's Hispanic, whether it's Asian, and we have to have more representation on the boards. Doesn't mean throw off the people you have now, but at least look at that issue when a term is up and you have to replace that person.
And we found there are communities, like Bloomfield is an example of a very diverse community, and their Board of Ed represents like a broad range of diversity as well. So, you know, certainly there are issues, but we recognize that there are variations across the state. And a lot of that also parallels what's going on in different parts of the country. So we're not alone in, you know, needing to address some of these issues.
I think that since we last met, the Judge McCaushire ruler came out.
Yes.
Does CABE have a position on that? And if so, can you tell us about it?
Sure. Kate has been a part of the Connecticut Coalition for Justice and Education, the plaintiff group, since it was created, and this litigation has gone on now for 12 years. A little hard to imagine. And we still obviously don't have a final resolution. The judge's decision contained a great deal of his personal observations. He was a very active judge throughout the 60 days of the trial with 50 witnesses. He probably asked as many questions of the witnesses as the attorneys for the parties did. So he gathered a lot of information. He was very interested in a number of topics, including high school graduation requirements and special education services. And he offered his views on those issues in his decision. The actual ruling did not contain any specific orders. The requirement in his ruling was that within 180 days, the state would come back with a response on those various issues. That has all been held in abeyance, given the fact that the Connecticut Supreme Court accepted the appeal filed by the Attorney General, which was focused on the various education policy issues, and also agreed that they would actually examine the entire decision, including the adequacy of funding, which was the thrust of the case. The various other issues, high school graduation requirements and special education, those were not issues that either of the parties raised as part of the litigation. So now we wait. In essence, what the judge offered his opinions on certainly got the attention of the governor and of many legislators. And at this point, the governor has repeatedly said that we shouldn't wait for a final court decision to address school funding issues. Thus, we expect to see a proposal from the governor on February 8th. We won't have any more direction from the judicial system for probably 10 months. It's anticipated at this time that the Supreme Court won't hear arguments in the case until the fall term. And it would have no way of knowing. I doubt that the Supreme Court will turn around a decision quite as quickly as the Superior Court judge did.
I think your point about special ed not being part of the initial case was it's very important, because it was introduced by the judge, and he did bring in some experts, with particular point of view. The issue of special ed, we don't need to be reminded, but, it's worth putting on the table. The issues about special ed are very important, and they're very far from fully established, even though PL 94-142 was passed, in a long time ago. There still is a lack of consistent integration of special ed services within districts, even if they are trying very hard. But there are some very sensitive issues, some very controversial issues, and even, just as recently as a few days ago, we need to be reminded that the special ed mandates are federal mandates. This is not something that's just left up to the states, to do as they please or as we please. This is something that we're required, and it's a mandate that we're not in any way suggesting should be rolled back.
Well, one of the problems districts are finding, though, that it seems like the number of children who are identified as needing special services has begun to go up again. Usually, over the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, the number of students was approximately at 12% going down, making up about 20% of a district's budget. Now we find in some districts it's going up to 14, 15%. And we go out of our way. We don't want to pitch special education students against the rest of the student population, but those numbers are very concerning. And they're very concerning especially in the cities, like New Haven or Bridgeport or Stamford. I mean, there's so much poverty, so much concern for our students in those areas. And those districts, in particular, have, as you probably know, all three, well, it's New Haven, it's Hartford, and it's Bridgeport, have interim superintendents at this point. They're all looking for people who can do things, but with the deficits, especially in Hartford and Bridgeport, not that I'm saying New Haven doesn't have fiscal concerns either, but it's become harder and harder to find the right people to take care of these positions, take these jobs.
And that's very important. So we have a shortage area in terms of staffing, and that's long-term, but it's not getting better fast. And we also have disproportionality. So we have, some districts, as you say, there's a higher prevalence, and in some communities it may be 50% of the overall population can be directly associated with multiple risk factors that the students are growing up with, and limited experience for a lot of people. So when we see much higher prevalences of certain kinds of conditions in particular, that should raise a flag for us. And Walter Gilliam is somebody local who, at Yale, but he's done a lot of excellent research that's recognized nationally and internationally on issues like implicit racism and other kinds of issues, like the whole issue of expulsion and suspension. He was focusing on very young children who were being expelled or suspended even at the age of 5. So it's clear that in order to change those patterns and trends, we need to provide appropriate services and to avoid having students go down a path that is avoidable. There are prevention opportunities, and so for the general public to recognize that it's cost effective to provide appropriate services is very important. When you talk about the increasing prevalence, when you cut back on services, it's not surprising that there might be a simultaneous increase in issues that are not being prevented. We can't assume causality there, but we can look at those statistics and say very likely that increase is due to a lack of services.
And there's a lack of understanding, I think, in the public about the services required for special education. And we hear all the time about, well, why don't you regionalize it, put all the kids with special needs in one building? Well, the law very clearly says, and there is a court case now before the U.S. Supreme Court clarifying this, but says that you have to provide a free, appropriate public education, which means that students have to be in the classrooms of all the students.
Restrictive environment.
Exactly.
And you have what we call the presumption of inclusion, which is like the special ed version of presumption of innocence in legal terms. It doesn't mean that every student will be 100% included in a general classroom, but we start with that as an option, and if it doesn't, we may or may not have to actually implement it depending on the circumstance, but we start with considering that, and then we look at other more restricted or more structured kinds of opportunities.
Patrice, you want to talk about burden of proof as long as we're on special education?
Sure.
As a mandate.
We are one of only 5 or 6 states that puts the burden of proof in the situation of a special education hearing always on the Board of Education. Normally, as in other types of proceedings, the burden of proof is on the party that brings the action. By putting the burden always on the Board of Education, the Board of Education has to show essentially that this is the best program possible for the individual child. That burden is such that in many cases, a school district will make an economic decision to not go to due process, to provide the out-of-state residential placement that the parent and their advocate are promoting, because it's simply not cost effective to go through that whole process. If the board loses, they have to pay the parents' attorney's fees, and they then still have to pay the cost of the placement. That's not necessarily in the best interest of the students, because sometimes what a parent thinks might be best for a child is not educationally the most appropriate placement. So we are looking at ways to bring our system more in line with what other states have done. It's not about restricting services to students. It's about having a balanced decision-making process.
And I think your point about outplacement, or, when there are very specialized residential placements that sometimes are warranted, but most often may not be, they can cost in the neighborhood of $220,000 a year for one student. And, some of them are out of state. I think it's important, as we consider options, that we recognize that spending that amount of money for one student doesn't necessarily result in a better option. That there are a lot of very creative, caring, appropriate options that might be much more cost effective. So it's a different frame of reference, really, and, I think another thing is we consider possible adjustments to the burden of proof, that we want to make it really clear that we're not in opposition to families, that we're not trying to be adversarial or unsupportive or anything like that. It's more, a legal process, and in any event, families deserve quality educational opportunities for their children, and also the families are entitled to support. If they don't speak English, they should have translators there. Every opportunity should be present to help them understand the systems, which are complex under the best of circumstance. But
Well, one of the concerns we have, and it's listed here under funding initiatives, is that the Department of Developmental Services, DDS, has told school districts that they will no longer pay for some of these residential placements. So that's another thing that will possibly $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 that are going back to school districts if things aren't changed. That's another concern of ours. And so while these costs are going up, we now have, excuse me, this morning I'm really bad. With water? That'd be great, thank you. One of the concerns is the 2.5% cap on the budgets of municipalities. So what will probably happen in the state is that the state will provide to probably many districts less funding, and then there's sort of the towns and cities are sort of cut off from going above 2.5% to make up for it. And we think that will hit the districts too.
we have an interesting situation now with the minimum budget requirement. On the one hand, towns are required to spend, like a certain amount, but on the other hand, their resources are being depleted. So it's kind of a left hand and a right hand, and need for coordination, and like a real need for the issues to be addressed by the legislature.
Does Kate have a position on support of undocumented students in Connecticut, or I guess that was a loaded question. I apologize for that. Do you have a position on undocumented students? Sure.
I'll let you answer it too, but I was thinking that just yesterday I received an email that was kind of an email blast from a professional organization that I'm associated with, and this week there's a lot that's going on, and organizations seem to be taking different stances in terms of whether or not they're going to put out a policy statement right now about that kind of issue. There are related issues, but then I'll let you, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think that it got me, wondering if that's something we might
Thank you so
consider
much.
doing or not. It's hard to decide, because we're most definitely a nonpartisan organization.
The position of school boards has been that when a student arrives and has appropriate information indicating that they are a resident of the community, then they are welcomed into the school. And I don't think school boards want to be put in the position of going beyond that in terms of checking a child's status. So.
And there are a lot of towns that are talking about sanctuary status, for their communities. And also what comes to mind is a community like Mansfield, which, people might think, oh, upper middle class, but actually economically it's not. Because my internal joke is that it's because of all the graduate students who don't have income while they're going to school. But they also have, I think, 72 different languages represented. So even though that's not necessarily exactly your question, related to your question with undocumented situations, the whole issue of people coming from various parts of the world and, living in the community, whether it's New Haven or Hartford or Mansfield or other towns, these are really important issues for communities to deal with. And I would say probably the spirit is exactly what you said, that we would not encourage districts to push families away.
Does Connecticut not have a constitutional right to educate all of its students?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the sanctuary community, from my understanding, I wouldn't consider myself an expert on that, but just from what little I've read, that they would be supportive rather than seeing their role as needing to call the federal government right now and tell on this family that they're there. I also attended a refugee resettlement session on Monday, and there are families moving into certain states, and Connecticut would be one of them, who are, coming from places like Syria and, really needing to leave because of impossible circumstances where they came from. And so, these definitely are issues that we need to address educationally, and in terms of curriculum as well.
So what does a family need to prove to get a student enrolled in school that they're a resident? Like, how do they prove that?
They show a receipt for their rent, indication that they have a library card, phone bills, some sort of.
So nothing that really indicates whether they're documented, undocumented, they live here, they're a member of the community,
No, but resident within the confines of that school district, there are a multiple number of ways that they can show that.
It might be comparable to getting a driver's license, how you have a choice, you have the menu, one from this column, one from this column, and, and I'm just going through the process. It's been a while, but they've changed it.
But you usually have to show your passport and
Well,
things
you have
like
to
that,
show
or a birth
something,
certificate.
birth
so-
certificate, and
Yeah.
I think even the process of getting a driver's license is more complicated now than it once was.
Before we get too far away from due process and special education, I'm not sure, I thought I was hearing a little bit of a mixed message. So Patrice, I heard from you that the burden of proof should be on the family challenging the placement.
Well,
Okay.
It could be the school, if the school is challenging, but if
Perhaps, right.
it's a family.
But it's the school's determination where the student's placed.
No, it's an agreement through the planning and placement team. It has to be agreed upon by the parties.
Right, so the team part of it would stay the same. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Oh, yeah.
So the team part would stay the same. It's really the initiation part of it that would change. And the legalese, you're the expert with that, but, when you hear words like burden of proof, it's hard to think of it as, just a legal process, because it sounds burdensome, just the choice of words, but it is a legal term.
Yeah, but going on with burden of proof, I thought I heard you sort of indicate that maybe it's a system that could be moved away from. Does this game not have some sort of position where perhaps it's absurd that that, one party really needs to sue the other just over where.
Oh, it's not even suing,
Yeah.
even, it's more like if a parent wants a different option to be considered for their student.
Right.
If they're the ones who are bringing it up, and correct me if I'm wrong, then if the burden of proof shifted, currently, it's the school's responsibility to pay for this regardless of who brings it up in Connecticut. Connecticut's one of a small number of states that still has the school being responsible. There are most states, is that accurate? Most states actually have shifted the burden of proof so that the party who's bringing up the issue, just, calling a meeting or whatever, like we want to consider other options.
Right. Is the system itself effective?
Well, there has to be a way to resolve disputes.
Right.
It is certainly true that when you reach the level of a due process hearing, you have gotten to a point in the process where relationships between the family and the district are probably at a point where they are not going to be able to be a healthy relationship. And that's a problem particularly if you're talking about a 4-year-old child who is going to live in that district and be educated by that district until they're 21 years old. So districts do work hard to avoid getting to that point. Due process hearings also have the downside of it pulls professional staff out of their classes, including staff that's working with other special needs children, in order to be available for what can be days and days of hearings. So one of the things we are looking at, and some legislators are interested in, is a process that would have a stronger role for a mediator and a way to try and help both parties see what might be realistic as opposed to driving them further apart. So we're exploring that.
Yeah. And along those lines, what I was hoping to say is that that there are a lot of differences that can be resolved, through healthy communication. And we don't expect that everybody is necessarily going to agree with each other all the time. But, when we're talking about children who have challenges, sometimes misunderstandings can be resolved just, through some healthy communication, and that's where the mediation comes in. So in the best of all possible worlds, from my perspective, the more we can resolve issues without going through like a very complex legal process, the better off people are.
And lawyers are used to working with mediation and understand that, and they'd be able to still represent those sides well.
Does that make sense to you? Is that clarified it for you?
Yeah, oh, sure, yeah. It's just, I think it's always been interesting.
Yes, and if you,
Yeah.
I was going to say that if you're the one who's writing an article, so if you wanted to do a draft and send it, and give us an opportunity, I don't know if that's part of your procedure usually, but I would be open to
Usually
that.
explicitly sort of against our procedure.
Oh, yeah. All right. Sorry, we just because there are some details that are very complex, and sometimes just the wording can make a difference. So anyway.
Sure. Yeah. CABE is a non-partisan organization. You said that still you're trying to maybe influence some town committees. Is it possible for a Board of Education to be non-partisan?
Well, there are certainly at least one in Connecticut. The board members do not run on party lines. You run independently. It's the same pretty much in New York, but it's very rare in Connecticut. We try to provide professional development to board members and tell them when you get to the boardroom, we know you remain on party lines, sort of put away that part of what got you there. Instead, focus on the children. Everybody focusing on the children doesn't always happen, but very often it does in a well-run school district, and with a board that is highly effective. You'd see people working across party lines, and sometimes they even tell me, I don't even know what party the other board members are.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we're required statutorily to have representation from both major parties. That's, if we don't, then we have to go back and vote, we have to bring somebody in. You look like you had another question.
Well, I asked the question because my next question was, is it possible for a Board of Education to be non-political?
That's a very interesting philosophical question. It has practical implications.
Sure.
That was an issue we were talking about just yesterday, because I think some people might like us to be non-political, but at the same time, we are driven by statutory requirements. We have a lot of statutory requirements, even apart from the mandates. Our budget is statutory. It's approved by the governor and legislature, and so, we're not at liberty to just do our own thing. So in a sense, we are, a public entity. So I think there's some basic aspects of it that if we look at governance, if we take away the word political, or maybe we could think about the polite part of political, that we may redefine political, but certainly in terms of governance, we don't have the liberty of just being separate from those systems.
What, did you mean something specific by political?
Politics is obviously the exercise of power. I'm just thinking, what I'm building towards is I'm thinking, right, you were talking about interim superintendents. Right now, the Board of Education in New Haven is looking to begin the process of searching for a full-time superintendent.
We've talked about that.
We have. You were there at the very beginning of that launch.
Yes.
The
creation.
Yeah. So, when it comes to boards of education seeking a superintendent, how should they include the community if you feel there's a right way to do it?
We usually recommend, when I go out, and you've heard me say this, is the board act as a committee of the whole.
Right.
It's obviously going to make the final decisions. But districts do it in two ways. Either they have a search committee of other people who may screen candidates, or they hire a consultant, and they may hire a consultant and use a committee, but they hire a consultant who does sit down with various people selected by the board generally, and interview them. What are you looking for in a superintendent? That type of thing. That's a way to bring people in. They often do a town hall meeting. There might be questionnaires or surveys done through SurveyMonkey or something now on the internet. But they will sit down with people individually and talk about what are you looking for. And it shouldn't be political. It should be a question of who are the people who, if you're going to ask your consultant, who often stays for 1 or 2 or 3 days talking to people, it shouldn't be political. It should be the people who are most involved in the town or city. It should certainly be talking to people on the board, coming together and putting together some kind of a document very often at the end, which will describe not only a political, this is what the Democrats said or Republicans, but just this is what the community thinks about what we're going to need in a new superintendent.
So I'm going to wrap up here, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please call us anytime we can be of help.
And that's fantastic.
It's always a pleasure.
Always.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.